What if love binds reality together? What if love isn't just something we feel, but something we live within? The very logic by which existence holds together. Beneath everyday longings for connection and meaning lies a more elemental inquiry. Why does anything exist at all? Why does the world not collapse into silence and formlessness? What prevents the succession of moments from unraveling into incoherence? And perhaps most haunting of all, does time have a direction, a purpose, or are we adrift in a cosmos moving nowhere? To ask about love in this deeper frame is to ask these questions not sentimentally but structurally. Is love the force that says yes to being, that allows time to unfold rather than fracture? This is not theological comfort, it is metaphysical architecture. The claim is not that God feels love, but that love is how divine intent becomes temporal reality. If reality endures, if it coheres, connects, and continues, it may be because love is not ancillary to being, but its very condition. The following analysis does not begin with abstractions, but with a structure, one in which love operates not as emotion, but as the logic of existence itself. Through this lens, love is not what redeems the world after the fact. It is what makes the world moment by moment possible. God's love, understood deeply through the Hebrew concept Ahavat, is far more profound than mere affection or emotional favor. Within the Torah's language and deeper logic, Ahavat encodes a fundamental metaphysical reality. It is the active, intentional, and coherent unfolding of existence itself. This divine love is not passive. It is the very operation by which reality comes into being, sustains itself, and moves toward meaningful completion. Thus, it is intrinsically bound with the concept of time, not simply chronological passage, but purposeful, affirmational time, infused with divine intent. Ahavat is therefore the temporal expression of God's engagement with creation, the active principle that animates existence, structures coherence, and impels reality toward fulfillment. By encoding a triadic pattern of affirmation, coherence, and drive, Ahavat reveals itself as the operative mechanism through which divine intent manifests in temporal reality, binding past, present, and future into a continuous and purposeful whole. Affirmation is the foundational dimension of divine love, the primal yes, the original consent that allows reality to exist and unfold. This affirmation represents God's active validation of existence itself, an initial divine permission for potential states of being to become actualized. Without affirmation, existence remains merely potential, silent, and inert. It is symbolized by the Hebrew letter Aleph, representing silent unity and the primordial creative act. Affirmation is thus not merely a positive feeling but an active metaphysical stance, a deliberate decision by the divine to sustain reality moment by moment. It is precisely the divine acceptance and consent that anchors existence continuously in the present moment, actualizing all potential into concrete states of being and enabling subsequent processes of integration and directional movement. Coherence, the integrative function of love, ensures that the multiplicity of existence does not fragment into chaos, but is woven continually into a harmonious and consistent unity. Represented by the Hebrew letter Bet, which symbolizes a house or dwelling, coherence provides a relational space wherein differences can coexist meaningfully, allowing the system of existence to maintain its integrity over time. Coherence is thus the principle responsible for binding moments together, preserving identity through change, and correcting inevitable deviations and disruptions. By holding reality within a relational, integrative framework, coherence ensures continuity, stability, and structural harmony across temporal progression. It transforms discrete events into meaningful narratives, distinct beings into connected communities, and isolated moments into coherent histories. Without coherence, the universe would dissolve into incoherent fragments, incapable of sustaining purposeful existence. Drive is the dimension of divine love that imparts direction and purpose to reality's unfolding, ensuring that the processes set in motion by affirmation and unified by coherence move toward fulfillment, completion, and ultimate purpose. Symbolized powerfully by the Hebrew letter He, representing revelation, breath, and outward movement, drive introduces a dynamic forward thrust, preventing reality from stagnation or meaningless circularity. It is the teleological force embedded within existence itself, compelling it forward toward ever greater realization and fulfillment of divine intent. Drive ensures that existence is not random or aimless, but purposeful and goal-oriented, propelling creation steadily toward its intended end state. Thus, divine love through drive guarantees a meaningful future, sustaining hope, possibility, and continuous evolution toward completeness, ensuring the meaningful progress of creation's unfolding journey. At the beginning, the triad is in a state of undisturbed harmony. Affirmation Aleph. As origin generates the conditions for being, it is the primal yes that allows things to arise. Coherence, Bet, as dwelling provides structure to that origination, forming a relational house in which difference can be safely received. Drive, He, is present as breath, animating the system with forward openness, but it does not overpower. In this stage, everything coexists in mutual implication. Being is affirmed, structured, and moved. This is divine love in its most stable form, pure, generative, balanced. The origin is not isolated, the structure not confining, the motion not urgent. Past, present, and future interweave without fracture. However, even this balance contains within it a latent fragility. When origin, Aleph, becomes severed from relation, when its transcendence detaches from its immanence, it tends toward isolation. The primal source withdraws into abstract priority and no longer actively affirms what follows. As this happens, coherence, Bet, loses touch with its relational grounding, becoming formal without foundation. Drive, He, in turn loses the breath of origination and becomes inert. Thus all elements begin to negate each other in a passive stasis. The equilibrium here is not peace but stalled isolation. Nothing collapses, but nothing progresses. Love persists as concept, but not as motion. To break the stasis, the system reasserts itself through strength, the second face of Aleph. Here, affirmation becomes forceful. The yes is no longer just permissive, but compelling. Being must be affirmed again, now with energy, not just allowance. This leads to coherence reinforcing itself by structuring the force of affirmation into form. It builds a container strong enough to hold what is surging. That structure empowers drive, which now carries purpose with intensity. Drive, in turn, cycles back to reinforce origin, breathing power into its root again. This is the stage of reanimation. Divine love takes on momentum, but the very force that reanimates will soon threaten to overwhelm. As strength intensifies, affirmation devolves into domination. The ox no longer bears, it tramples. Coherence suffers next. It cannot maintain the balance between force and structure. The house becomes strained under the weight of compulsion. Drive, having become hyperactive, no longer flows with purpose, but barrels forward unchecked. As drive unravels, it strips meaning from structure, and structure can no longer uphold origin. The system collapses in a feedback loop of negations. Each function, corrupted, undermines the others. Divine love here has become coercive. Time becomes oppressive. The original affirmation is no longer a gift. It is a demand. From this crisis, the only way forward is authority, not control, but righteous instruction. Affirmation reconstitutes itself not as raw origin or overpowering force, but as wisdom, the capacity to speak, to name, to teach. This restores coherence not as rigid structure, but as intelligible form. The house becomes legible again. Drive resumes motion, but now under guidance. The causal logic is clear. A true affirmation leads to structure, which leads to purposeful movement. But if affirmation fails, drive fails. There is no meaning in action without original validation. Love now expresses itself as an educational cosmos. Created reality is taught to be itself, moved by understanding. Yet even teaching contains the seed of its own negation. Authority, when rigidified, becomes control, dogma, prescription, and imposed certainty. Coherence begins to flatten. Structure is no longer responsive but fixed. Drive may still function, but without creative freedom, It becomes execution of predetermined plans. This reverses the flow. Movement no longer arises from affirmation, but instead loops back and claims to produce origin. The future seeks to dictate the past. Love loses openness and turns into system. It no longer teaches through revelation, but governs through restriction. The cycle now teeters on the edge of collapse. Coherence is strained, and the house is no longer a home. In this stage, coherence arises through enclosure. The divine yes, Aleph, drives creation forward, and that movement, drive he, seeks stability through boundary, coherence bet. Here, enclosure does not restrict, it defines space, making relation possible. The house of love is drawn not to contain but to allow boundaries mark identity, create sanctuary, and shape becoming. Coherence emerges as the result of movement organizing itself into relational space. The system does not move linearly but folds inward, deepening. Divine love at this point is architectural. It creates worlds in which things can endure. Yet even the most nurturing enclosure carries risk. It may become confinement. The house walls off too tightly. What once held becomes what now traps. The negation of coherence as enclosure leads to a breakdown in affirmation. It becomes unclear whether the system was ever truly saying yes to being or only yes to controlled existence. Drive, when met with too rigid boundaries, stalls. Retrospective logic dominates. Meaning is not discovered, but reconstructed from within limits. The past begins to rewrite the present. Love turns inward, not in contemplation but in claustrophobia. A system unsure whether it welcomes the other or imprisons it. To move forward, the system must assert opposition, the second face of bet. Enclosure gives way to distinction. True coherence does not erase difference, it holds it. Here love affirms the other, not by dissolving contrast, but by integrating duality. The structure of love becomes inclusive by weaving tensions into harmony. Drive now re-engages, energized by the integrity of distinction. Divine love flourishes in paradox, unified multiplicity, not blurred sameness. The system breathes again, not because boundaries vanish, but because opposition has become mutual, not adversarial. But opposition can degrade into division. Instead of difference in relation, the system begins to interpret boundaries as borders. Affirmation withdraws, unwilling to engage what is other. Coherence now divides rather than binds. Drive loses its connection to origin. It becomes reactive, oppositional, defensive. Love becomes tribal. Affirmation is for insiders only. The coherence that once sustained multiplicity now fragments it. The house becomes many isolated rooms, walled off from one another. The system speaks in terms of exclusion, not invitation. Unity is replaced by separation, masquerading as order. The crisis forces coherence to its third mode, structure. Here, coherence seeks to reclaim its unifying function by creating relational scaffolding. Each function turns toward coherence. Affirmation seeks a structure it can inhabit. Drive seeks a direction it can channel through. Bet becomes the conjoining point. No longer just holding difference, it begins to synthesize it. This is love as covenantal architecture. Affirming and propelling are both shaped through coherent form. The house is not just a container but a design, a shared structure through which love becomes durable and time gains intelligibility. But if structure hardens, it becomes a bottleneck. Instead of channeling energy, it restricts it. Affirmation and drive both falter, not because they're absent, but because the coherence mechanism fails to translate them. The structure is no longer responsive to the flow of being, it demands submission to form. The system chokes on its own internal logic. Coherence, meant to bind and uplift, now filters and reduces. The house of love becomes a bureaucratic machine. Movement stalls, affirmation collapses, and what remains is function without soul. The divine yes is still spoken, but now through grinding teeth. Here, drive asserts itself as opening, the aperture through which divine love becomes dynamic. This is not mere motion, but possibility. Drive allows the affirmed and structured system, Aleph and Bet, to breathe, move, and stretch toward what is yet to be. The system becomes mutually generative. Affirmation and coherence give rise to drive, but drive also re-energizes both. Love is no longer only sustaining and ordering, it is inviting. Opening makes time permeable. The future is no longer closed, but accessible. Divine love here is an ever-expanding symmetry, where each pair of elements affirms the third in a fluid, self-balancing relation. But opening, when untethered, becomes disruption. When the aperture widens too far, structure, coherence, destabilizes, and the original intent, affirmation, loses anchoring. The result is dissonance. Drive no longer reveals possibility but disperses identity. Too many options, too little clarity. The triad's mutuality collapses into mutual negation. The rhythm breaks, the harmonic turns to noise. Divine love begins to fracture into activity without cohesion. The call to possibility becomes a distraction from presence. Love still opens, but now into incoherence. The system is free but not safe. It can move but not toward. The system reasserts itself through designation. Drive no longer merely opens, it names. To designate is to direct, to declare identity and orientation. Every function now implies the others. Drive contains the shape of origin and structure, and vice versa. Time becomes integrative. Movement names and locates the moment in relation to past and future. This triad converges because each element expresses the whole. Divine love here is directional presence. It does not merely sustain or open, it points, it invites, it declares. The cosmos is no longer a place where love might occur, it is a place where love knows its name. But designation can decay into fixation. Names become roles, directions become destinies, and the system becomes rigid. Each element demands the others, but not in freedom, independence. If drive no longer permits reinterpretation, coherence fractures, and affirmation falters. The system becomes conditional. Each function requires both others to remain valid, and the loss of one triggers collapse. Divergence replaces convergence, not by chaos, but by excessive ordering. There is too much clarity, too little adaptability. Divine love turns into categorical identity, movement into preassigned routes. There is no longer discovery, only repetition. Now drive achieves its final form as revelation, not as sudden light but as the system revealing itself to itself. Each pair of elements either gives rise to the third or collapses without it. Revelation completes the arc of drive. What was opened and named now shines forth. Time becomes transparent. Divine love no longer needs to explain itself. It is manifest in action, motion, and being. This is not spectacle, it is clarity. The world, coherently affirmed and dynamically expressed, reveals its source. Revelation is not a rupture. It is the appearance of meaning through form. Love is no longer only a force, it is understood. But even revelation can break apart. When it tries to stand alone, without grounding in origin or coherence, it becomes exposure without integrity. Revelation turns divisive. Each element appears more like a reaction to the absence of others than a true expression of unity. Drive continues to declare, but what it declares is incomplete. Meaning fragments into isolated insights. The system cannot converge because its disclosures no longer cohere. Affirmation lacks echo, coherence lacks shape. Love continues to express, but nothing binds the expressions. This is revelation without recognition, truth declared but not integrated. Having reached revelation, the individual can no longer remain isolated. The presence of divine love now seeks resonance. This triad marks the beginning of association, the search for others who have likewise received and integrated the structure of Ahavat. Each pairing, affirmation and coherence, coherence and drive, drive and affirmation, demands the third to be meaningful. This triad signals an important transition. God's love, once internal, now seeks shared articulation. The individual longs not just to embody love, but to live it in community of understanding. Divine love becomes relational knowing. However, this stage is fragile. Misalignment here doesn't break the structure, it isolates the bearer. This is the moment of spiritual loneliness. The bearer of divine love, if unrecognized, begins to disassociate, not from truth, but from context. In a world where others cannot perceive or reciprocate revelation, the drive becomes unanchored. Coherence breaks first. The individual can no longer find a shared relational field. Affirmation weakens as its origin feels unsupported. Drive becomes desperate, sometimes turning reactive, mystical, or chaotic. The internal structure still exists, but it begins to flicker in isolation. Divine love, so long nurtured, now feels alien. The bearer is not broken, but estranged. And yet, if the bearer resists disassociation, something greater becomes possible: integration. In this final affirmed triad, the structure folds back into itself, but in a new mode. The individual no longer seeks merely to express love outward, but to contain and reconcile it fully within. Drive and affirmation are now understood through coherence. Revelation and origin are fused into meaningful internal structure. Love here is not simply known or shown, it is embodied. This is the triad of selfhood reconstituted, not egoic, but ontologically restructured by divine rhythm. The house of love becomes portable. The bearer is the structure. But if the internal structure cannot hold, the system collapses. This is disintegration, not a fall into evil, but a fragmentation of divine logic in the self. Without coherence, affirmation and drive become unstable. The yes becomes uncertain, and movement becomes erratic or forced. The bearer may still remember love, still seek its truth, but the parts no longer support one another. The structure is remembered, but no longer inhabited. Love, which once breathed the system into being, now becomes memory, longing, or abstraction. And so the final threat arises. The danger here is existential severance, the inability to live what one knows, and that is the final choice. Heaven or hell? This inquiry has taken us through a progression, not simply of logic, but of life. From the boundless origination of being to the intimate, embodied call to awaken others. The triadic system of affirmation, coherence, and drive maps not just a metaphysics, but a spiritual topology. The question posed at the beginning, what if love is the very logic of reality, now stands answered not as hypothesis, but as structural revelation. The initial three-stage arc demonstrates the cosmic frame we initially established. At the beginning, divine love breathes the cosmos into being, not as sentiment, but as structure. Through affirmation, reality receives its first yes. Through coherence, this yes takes shape. Through drive, the shape begins to move. Love here is cosmic grammar. It orders being, prevents collapse, and initiates direction. Yet even divine strength risks distortion. These early triads show how love must not just initiate but correct itself. Recohere after overreach, reaffirm after breakdown. The second three stages address the human condition. From cosmos to culture, love enters the world of boundary, opposition, and relation. Human systems echo the divine architecture, but in the brittle medium of distinction. In these triads, love learns to live with difference, not to dissolve it, but to hold it well. This middle arc is deeply anthropological. It names the risk and necessity of structure, the danger of borders mistaken for barriers, and the possibility of covenantal life. Love here is structural wisdom. How relation survives through enclosure without becoming confinement. The third arc shows the interior journey from triads 7 to 9. The system then turns inward. Love becomes not just cosmic or cultural, but personal and revelatory. Drive, now matured, brings not only motion but insight. Here, love becomes fully dynamic and reciprocal, not just sustaining but self-aware. The individual no longer receives the structure, they become it. This arc is about embodiment and disclosure, the moment when divine logic is not only understood but lived. It is the difference between knowing love and being love. The final two triads demonstrate that revelation demands resonance. The bearer of divine love cannot remain alone, not forever. The final triads mark a decisive transition, from inner integration to relational activation. Love now seeks association and integration not for itself alone, but for others. These stages define the purpose of the whole system, not merely self-realization, but the awakening of others through the structural embodiment of divine logic. The final goal is not salvation in solitude, but communion through coherence. To carry love is to become its agent, its architecture in motion, its presence in another's becoming. Love is not a feeling. It is a function. At every level, cosmic, communal, personal, and integrative, love is what makes being possible. It affirms, coheres, and drives. It also stalls, divides, and collapses. The same logic that sustains creation can also betray it when corrupted. This is not sentimental theology. It is logical metaphysics, where divine love is the syntax of time, the grammar of relation, and the rhythm of becoming. The triads are not merely stages, they are rhythms of reality. Every person, community, and cosmos will pass through these affirmations and their negations. The goal is not to avoid negation, it is to survive it, to transform breakdown into reformation, to allow love to learn itself through its own undoing. Love is not what redeems the world after the fact. It is what makes the world moment by moment possible. To live in love is not to feel safe. It is to inhabit the structure that holds being together, even when it fractures. To embody love is not to escape the system. It is to become a living pattern through which others might be called awake. This is the arc of Ahavat, from breath to structure to movement, from God to world to self, and finally, to everyone.